back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. It's interesting. I've been approached recently on several different occasions to give advice on marriage. And, I'm always a little skeptical um, to get involved in other people's relationships because it's, you know, you know, my mom always had a saying, what happens within the framework or the walls of somebody's home, it's always hard to judge and to come to a fair conclusion without being in somebody's home and really knowing the intricate sort of connection values and sort of the knowledge of how relationships ever work. And in that situation, I'm always hesitant. But what I can do is give some general advice when it comes to things like that. For my part, I've been married now for 19 years. Me and my wife have been together for 22 years, and I consider marriage actually the greatest blessing of my life. Uh, my wife to me and my children are everything. And I've never had a greater blessing apart from, of course, my mother, my father, and my familial line of ancestry, my aunts, uncles, cousins, things like that I grew up with. I cherish those just as much. But of course, in that real deep, intimate connection that when you form your own family, my wife has been, just like I said, the greatest blessing ever. And I can highlight some of the things that I've experienced through marriage, the highs and some of the lows. And the lows is a very relative term for me because the lows are oftentimes the world around us that throws curveballs at us. I consider my marriage a success in every capacity. And this goes back to, I remember before I got married, people in the secular world telling me that marriage was a doomed institution, that it had no future, and that I should run from it. But of course, as a Catholic, we're raised with a sense of vocation, right? That we have certain duties that God has called us to. And either you're going to, join the priesthood as a male or some kind of religious life, or you're going to go into the vocation of marriage and bring about a family into this world. And that's what I chose when I was a young man, obviously. And I think, as Catholics, when we look at the outside world in a secular society, oftentimes it tries to throw us for loopholes. Because I think, like I said so many times in this show, the entire battle of our existence, really since the Garden of Eden, has been our fallen nature. Satan trying to tempt us into surrendering our souls, all the way to the last moment of our lives, because it's a battle for salvation at the end of the day. Marriage to me is an institution that is designed to help you get or to achieve salvation. On top of it being a sacrament from God. And the reason why it is a sacrament, because God understands it and gave us it as a tool for salvation. Marriage matures both men and women. As I said before, many times before to you, I hate this left and right dichotomy world we live in, and this battle of the sexes, that it's men versus women and women versus men. Well, really, women versus men in a post-feminist society, something I despise, because I do believe that men and women are complementary creatures. God created us that way so that we can support one another and help each other achieve whatever it is we need to achieve. Obviously, we have our worldly or our material sort of fulfillments that we need, trying to raise a family, trying to live in this world while we best we can with honor and dignity while serving God. And of course, it's our spiritually ambitions as well too, to get to heaven ultimately with God. And marriage is designed to get us there. Marriage is designed for us to deal with the pitfalls of life in many respects as well too. But in a post-modern civilization, post-enlightenment civilization, where the church has been kicked to the sidelines and we've pushed things like, individual rights or individual freedoms and things of that nature, you mix that in with Protestantism that sort of unveiled sort of this false concept of individualized religion. Marriage has suffered greatly over the past couple hundred years, really over the past 60, 70 years, over the sexual revolution. We've seen that on steroids, but it's been suffering pretty much since the revolution of the Masons, because their concept of, again, self-autonomy or self-ambition, the individual serving himself, oftentimes runs contrary to the understanding of what marriage is, which is a covenant between a man and woman and God. And these relationships oftentimes are thrown off by modern society. And it's no wonder we've seen, again, the complete breakdown of the family within modernity, right? The divorce rate, the illegitimacy rates, the abortion rates, young ladies sterilizing themselves, not valuing motherhood anymore in the current modern world, passing up motherhood for modern liberal sensibilities like career and money and things of that nature. I said it before, I say it again. The Catholic world had a beautiful balance between the natural and the supernatural. And we've kind of thrown that out the window in sort of post-enlightenment civilization in favor of all natural, and religion's kind of ho-hum over here, something, whatever. We kind of believe, we kind of don't. And so that's just a general macro view of what I can tell you. But when it comes to the institution of marriage, and the advice that I would give is actually quite simple. And in many ways, it's the same advice I would give for any relationship that you have, right? Whether it's husband and wife, or mother and daughter, father and son, next door neighbors, your relationship with your government, your relationship with your church, your relationship with your business partner, your relationship with your coworkers on the job, whatever it may be. And that is quite simply, the further you deviate away from the church and the sacraments, the more disordered your relationships will be in your life. Now, obviously, the covenant of marriage between a man and a wife is much more intricate, and there's a lot more complexities that are involved in there, but there's also a lot more blessings that are involved in there too. And this is why, if you follow my time over at the Knights of Christendom, I've talked about the institution of marriage a lot and how it's been trivialized in modern culture, because we've deviated away from the church. We've deviated away from the sacraments. And as we deviate away, like I said earlier, all relationships become more disordered. The closer you are to the church, the closer you are to Christ. And the closer you are to Christ, the more well-ordered, well-balanced any relationship will be. That's why I say it's no coincidence between, again, all the disorder of our time, again, divorce rates, illegitimacy rates, shacking up out of wedlock, contraception use, all these things that the church condemned, and the breakdown of the family within modernity. That's not a coincidence. But of course, we have lost the faith, right? We're in the time of the great apostasy. Our Lady prophesied that we would be in a time of great apostasy in many of her apparitions. And this is what's come to pass. And we've all been propagandized into, again, embracing the material side or the material nature of the world, while the spiritual has been minimized to such a degree that really faith and religion don't exist anymore, really anywhere, to be honest with you. I mean, there's pockets of it, don't get me wrong. I think it was Pope Benedict XVI that said, in regards to faith and religion and what we understanding from, again, Our Lady's apparitions and the prophecy of the saints of the church, that the faith as the church went through its crisis and went through sort of had to walk its passion in many respects toward the end times, which I believe we're in, that the faith would be reduced to such small degrees that the apostasy was spread so far, so wide that the faith would essentially come down to a few homes and a few cottages. That's how small, in many respects, Christianity and the Catholic faith would have to go back down into the catacombs. And we see a dominant liberal culture that is effectively pushing Christians underground at this point in history, where our values are not even represented anymore. And the institution of marriage is one of those, right, where we've kind of redefined it. And in many respects, you got to give the liberal culture credit. They've taken something that's good and they didn't outright ban it, but they altered it. The first of which is they handed it over to the government, which is brilliant on the part of liberals and leftists. You take away an institution like marriage, people revolt because faith in religion in a time where it was ingrained in the culture wasn't very smart. But the slow separation of church and state, as we saw during the Enlightenment, and then infusing in the false concept of religious liberty was really the poison pill that would destroy everything. And marriage in that respect would be one of them in time, because through the concept of, again, religious liberty, you have a situation where you begin to not only dumb down the faith, but the definition of marriage is dumbed down with it, as now marriage really becomes indifferent in the hearts and minds of every individual family now, right? Because every individual family now can pick and choose their own personal moral codes via religious liberty. It was only a matter of time until religious liberty was not just going to affect sort of orthodoxy within the faith, but also affect relationships. That's why I keep telling you, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, you can't separate these from the turbulent times, the cultural confusion, and ultimately the familial destruction we've seen over the past 100 years. It's all connected here. And it starts by, again, watering down true faith and true religion. Because the faith is, again, is what protects us from the disorders of the world. And ultimately, lots of the demonic influences out there that we don't even acknowledge anymore in post-Enlightenment society. Now, I know I'm making a broad argument here, but it's important to understand why the institution of marriage has suffered. And in that context, understanding what is the success for marriage, what it takes to succeed in marriage, I should say. For my part, I remember when I met my wife, I was a nominal Catholic. I believed in the faith, but I was into the ways of the world. But I had this bedrock understanding and belief, philosophical principles within me that I would not compromise, because, you know, while I was into the ways of the world, my beliefs remained steady, just trying to find a moment in time where I could live up to the standards that our Lord set. And for me, when I met my wife, she was a Protestant, and we started dating, and she was a wonderful woman. But I remember thinking to myself that marrying outside the church was destructive. It's something that I was taught by the church and ultimately by our ancestral roots. And I understood the sacramental nature of marriage and how disordered Protestantism already was. And it was a sacrifice that I wasn't willing to make if my wife wasn't willing to convert. Now, my wife eventually converted to the Catholic faith, but she did it on her own accord. She didn't do it because of myself. That was the beautiful thing about it. She found the faith that was inspired in her. And it was that, again, that relationship we had with our faith, Christ, the Holy Mother, and the church that has been the strength and the bond that has given us such a strong marriage. And it's this thing that still brings us today, that refreshes, rejuvenates our love on a constant basis. When I was told by many of my friends, hey, marriage is a miserable institution, it gets old and you're going to be miserable. It's something that I never wanted to believe. And now that I've been in it for 19 years, I can happily say that those people were wrong, very wrong, to be honest with you. Marriage has been the complete fulfillment of my personal life and everything that I believe in and that encompass, and has given me stability as a man in a world, in a liberal world, with great temptation that is designed to destroy single men. Again, this is why I say the institution of marriage is designed to protect us, especially in a secular world. The institution is more important than ever before, because in a marriage between men and women, I'll speak at it from the aspect of a man. It gives us not only responsibilities and duties, but it matures us, right? Especially with the male, sexual nature. It gives us a sense of control, an ability to, again, pull ourselves out of this sexual license world that looks to destroy men in that capacity. I've railed against pornography and the entire license culture, the entire strip club culture, the party culture that we have now, right? The college experience in America. We all go to college and we're expected to experiment with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And that's an American rite of passage now, right? That's what our liberal sensibilities have given us. And, we even expect now that our kids are not supposed to maintain their purity in any kind of way. Everybody's doing it now. Everybody's having sex now. We're supposed to give our kids condoms when they're 15, 16 years old because we can't expect any better for them. You see how that's all broken down? Or just 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it was unthinkable that even parents would think that way. And for hundreds and not thousands of years, that's how people taught. But here we are in the past 40, 50 years, all these liberal sensibilities have kicked in and everybody has collapsed. Morality has collapsed. And with that has come the family, has come the collapse of the culture and the abject sort of corruption of the political system. It all flows from one another. This is why these times are so strange, why people can't make heads or tails of why things are falling apart. And it really begins in the home. It begins with the family, because the family is the backbone of civilization, not the individual, not autonomous individuals like many classical liberals claim, not the flaming, I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps. It's the family. It's a husband and wife and children, because God did tell us to procreate. That's what he told us. That's why contraception is a sin. That's why abortion is a sin, because they're blessings from God to give us. Family is a blessing. If we can pull ourselves out of our liberal sensibilities that told us that really the greatest virtue is going out there and making the money and achieving in the material world, it's a lie. But simply to sum it up, I think the success in this turbulent world is to stay closer to Holy Mother Church and the sacraments more than ever before. Understand her teachings, and that there's a wisdom there that goes back for thousands of years, a wisdom that our ancestors embraced. My parents, or should I say, just as my mother and my father passed on these values to me, they had it passed on by my grandparents, and they had it passed on by my great grandparents. These are time-tested principles that worked, that brought into existence not only healthy families and strong marriages, but vibrant cultures. I'll say it again, the previous generation, aunts and uncles, there is very little moral as a marital dysfunction within my family. We were Sicilian, we were Catholic, we were part of a sort of homogenous culture. Sicilians married other Sicilians. And in that respect, the Catholic faith and Catholic culture played a role. And I grew up seeing nothing but very strong families within my family, right? It was the outside world when we immigrated to America in the pluralistic world that we began to see strange concepts of families in America. Of course, you had Protestants, you had Jews, you had those that didn't believe in things of that nature. I can't comment on Jews as much, even though my wife is half Jewish, because I haven't had a whole lot of experience with Jews per se, other than my wife's family. But we've been distanced for a long time. We've just lived far apart. But in regards to my experiences with Protestantism, I can tell you that the dogmatic anarchy that is played out within their theological realm has played out again, in the destruction of the Protestant family. It's why, from my experience, Protestant families are some of the weakest families you could ever find, right? And that's not to say that Protestant families always lead to divorce or destruction per se, but sort of that extended network of family oftentimes is broken down within Protestant families. And that's why, as a Sicilian with strong familial bonds, oftentimes we not only have strong bonds within mother and father and child and brothers and sisters, but also extended cousins in many ways are seen as brothers and sisters. That's how these familial bonds often work. Now, in America, a lot of those familial bonds are broken down, right? Because we teach the concepts of individual rights, go out there, make the money in America, I serve myself. But again, I talk about the nature of disorder. The moment you begin to deviate away from the church, all these relationships begin to break down at some point. And as, again, American liberalism and Protestantism begin to play a role, they begin to sort of create havoc within the Catholic family in America. You have some family members now begin to venture to Protestantism. Others become sort of infatuated with making the money, the money, the money. You begin to see the faith break down, oftentimes within familial bonds. And with that comes great chaos and disorder. You know, it's difficult enough for myself, as I did not marry another Italian woman, understanding that that in time and space, this will matter down my familial line, because there's a cultural relevance and a cultural tradition that is important, that creates identity in every individual, in every person, in every family. And since my family line of Sicilians always married other Sicilians, there was genuine culture that was understood and built. There were the bonds oftentimes of many relationships, including marriage. But when you come to America in a pluralistic culture, and now Catholics start marrying Jews, or they start marrying Protestants, or they start marrying those that are less religious, in time and space, those familial bonds will begin to break down. But again, we're in a pluralistic culture. How you deal with that, right? If you're not marrying other Italians, or if Irish are not marrying other Irish, or Germans are not marrying other Germans, the only thing you got left to maintain any kind of social bond or familial unity is your faith, the Catholic faith. And it's why, for me, marrying another Catholic, devout Catholic woman was very important to me. That's what I found. The problem is oftentimes many Catholics will marry not only non-Catholics, Protestants, or things like that, but even other Catholics that are not very devout. And again, once that happens, it presents problems in the relationship. Not that these relationships always end up in divorce, but you can see some type of disorder constantly in most of these relationships. And very oftentimes they do lead to divorce, but even more so, they present disorders to the family line for generations to come. See, we've been brought up and raised in America to think about ourselves, individual rights, me, myself, and I serve myself and nobody else. For myself, I look at the world differently. Again, the values I inherited are values that go back along my familial line. When I preach my Catholic faith, when I tell you the sort of the goodness of the bonds that I formed over my years, it is out of respect for my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and all those other ancestors that came before me that really spit blood, sacrificed everything to make sure that I was here into this world. It's a story, the story that I give oftentimes. My father was the youngest of 7 siblings, born during the era right between World War I and World War II. When World War II broke out, my father was a very young boy. He used to tell me stories of the horrors and the images of the Allied bombing runs in Sicily, and the devastation that it caused to civilian populations. But it's interesting. My father was the youngest of 7 siblings in that time, and I'm always thankful that I was born of, I follow Sicilian ancestry where deep cultural roots mattered, in days where, again, having children was seen as a common good. Contraception and abortion were discouraged, because in many respects, with the poverty my family faced, it would have been more than encouraged in this day and age in America to simply contracept yourself sterile in the name of financial stability, right? Or abort your child in the name of financial stability, because that's what we put first in America now. These are our liberal values, right? If you don't have enough money, just contracept yourself sterile so you don't have the burden of bringing a child into this world. Well, in that old Catholic world, the bonds and the concept of the redemptive value of suffering was very important. That bringing children into this world, regardless of your economic viability, was essential as a part of our faith. And because of that, I'm here today. If the contraception mentality was alive in Sicily or Italy at the time, which I believe the contraceptive mentality ultimately comes from Protestantism, right? And see, Protestantism never made any inroads in Italy during the time of the Reformation and after that. Freemasonry did, don't get me wrong, Freemasonry did, but Protestantism did not. But if that contraception mentality was prevalent in Italy, I have always argued I probably wouldn't be here today, because there was every reason for my grandparents to contracept or abort or whatever it is. Right? My father never would have been born. And I think oftentimes we miss the point when we look at familial bonds in this way. Again, in America, 1.7 children per household. Think of us, how many of us would not be here if we had, or if our parents and grandparents had the contraception mentality in the old world. And think of all the ancestral lines that are being wiped out today because of feminism, and the women climbing up the workforce, or men saying, I don't want to take care of 15 kids or 10 kids or 5 kids. And I'm not saying there's not wiggle room for discussion about family size, but the general understanding that I serve me individual rights. I'm the autonomous individual, therefore I can't have any children. It breaks down the familial line, and it brings disorder to the family line eventually. That's why so many Catholic families that have European roots have broken down in America over time, right? I talk about the multi-generational family in America a lot, because I'm first generation. I'm not multi-generational. My kids will be second generation. My grandkids, hopefully, will be, third generation, things like that. And what will happen with my family line, while I'm doing my best to protect the faith, liberalism will encroach and will begin to spread dysfunction along my family line as well too, just like it will spread along almost everybody's family line, unless the faith is truly transcended within my family line. And that's my duty as a head of household. That's what I'm trying to do now, and something I could get better at. If the faith isn't protected, then we have no common values, we have no common culture, and eventually your ancestral line, or should I say your genealogical line, your family line, will eventually be watered down, right? With liberalism of some kind. First, it'll probably be Protestantism, then it'll probably devolve into some kind of spirituality, to the point where your family line will most likely believe in nothing at some point in time. But that disorder starts at some point in time by a family member that, for whatever capacity, rebelled. For a family member that said, I'm rejecting the faith of my parents, I'm rejecting the faith of my grandparents, right? And this is what America has done, because liberalism is very deceptive. It's given us choices, it's given us options in the name of individual rights and individual freedoms, right? The values that were so important to our grandparents, right? Regardless of financial viability, they had children. We're here in this country. Well, wait a minute now. We got modern medicine. We can pick and choose, kind of a thing, right? And there's no need for you to be poor and suffer, because classical liberalism despises the concept of the redemptive value of suffering, right? You ever talk to a classical liberal about that? They just think, no, our job here is to make the money, the economic engine of prosperity, and we're supposed to overcome suffering. But it's like we've been taught for a long time, without suffering, there could be no true love. And that love is expressed in those beautiful families that will have strong familial bonds, strong faith with them, that will actually preserve our civilization at some point. It's the last grace, is the last hope of humanity, is those, again, Catholic lines of families that are protecting the faith. And while the pool is shrinking, it will have to be those families that eventually rebuild our civilization as as those that have left the faith, have left the church, the wisdom, the sacraments, and the graces that we get continue to, again, apostatize and ultimately paganize once again, because that's what's happened across the globe, really, but really in the West, right? As we've seen this devolution from this great Catholic world with vibrant cultures and strong families, where we go from Catholicism to Protestantism, to variations of Protestantism, to Gnosticism, eventually into paganism. It's a giant circle that always sort of mankind is always revolving around. And we're entering that age of paganism again, where we've lost the faith. We've forgotten the faith, and the faith has broken down through the irresponsible acts of individuals who look to serve themselves first and foremost instead of God. And like I said, marriage, like every other institution, whether it's your relationship with your government, or whether it's a relationship with your kids or your aunts and uncles, or your neighbors, whatever it may be, the further you deviate away from the church, the sacraments, the eternal truth of God, the more problems you're going to have. The crisis of marriage, the breakdown of the family, is a crisis of faith. It's a crisis of the apostasy that Our Lady warned us about. Do you want a successful marriage? Or better yet, do you want actually a happy marriage? Simple. Find the faith of your ancestors, our Catholic faith. I know there's problems in the church, but nothing has fundamentally changed about our faith, even within those problems. The further you deviate away from the church, the more problems and the more disorder you're going to have within relationships. This is why millions of Americans, or millions of even Italians now, because the apostasy is everywhere now, right? But millions of people are waking up. They've been married 20, 30 years. They contracepted so many years. And now you have so many families that have no children at all. And so many women now that are like, okay, I did the career thing. I did the contraception thing. I took the wisdom of sort of the common secular culture. I abandoned my Catholic faith because I took this wisdom. It was common sense stuff. And now I'm in my mid-30s and late 30s and early 40s, and I can't have children. I've been robbed of something. I've been robbed of womanhood. In many respects, because women have been given this power over family, men have lost something too, and that is the patriarchal authority of their family. I mean, in many respects, men have lost their rights of kids, not only the rights of governing or raising their children, but even having children. Because oftentimes, because we've given that control to women since the feminist movement, men have lost control on how they are going to govern their family, or even what kind of family or what size of family they are to have. Everybody loses here. Got to remember, the West is not replacing itself at this point in history. You need 2.1 children per household just to maintain steady population growth. In America, we're down to 1.7. In Italy, we're down to 1.3. This is a dysfunction of our time. This is the crisis of our time. Next time you open up your web browser, you go to the news, you see all the bad news, right? The potential wars and the economy, the potential crash of the stock market, or the economy, or COVID, or whatever it is, all the disaster that looms all over the world, looking to destroy the world every day. Just remember, it's all one and the same crisis. It's the crisis of faith and the destruction of the family. Because all these disorders and all these crises that we read about every day, a lot of it is BS, don't get me wrong, but a lot of them are true too. It's a crisis of morality usually. True, there are some natural tragedies out there, don't get me wrong, I'm not discounting that, but most of this is a crisis of culture, starting with the very political leaders that we put into power. People have told me, oh, we're just living in a time of bad leadership, bad leadership. Yeah, but bad leadership is a byproduct of bad culture, and bad culture is a byproduct of broken families. Our broken culture is putting in power broken leaders, right? It's that simple. It really is, to be honest with you. And the reason why we have broken families is because the institution of marriage has been broken. It's been dumbed down. It's been watered down to mean effectively nothing, right? When a marriage is outside the church, when a marriage becomes cosplay, right? When you're walking down and he's dressed as Iron Man and she's dressed as Wonder Woman, right? And it's a giant cosplay kind of a thing that we see often now in America. It goes to show you what a mockery liberalism has made out of marriage, because marriage is a sacrament of God. And if you're not going to put God first in your marriage, there's no reason to ever get married, to be honest with you. See, we have fundamental problems here. If you got Elvis walking you down the aisle, I can tell you your marriage is most likely disordered at its origins. And because we have a highly sexualized society with a bunch of broken individuals, with the emphasis again on the economic engine of prosperity and making money and the worship of material items, this brings dysfunction. This brings disorder throughout every institution, including marriage. And people get into marriage for the wrong reasons, oftentimes. Oftentimes, they don't even understand what the institution of marriage is. And it is, in many respects, marriage, the primary purpose, one is it's a sacrament of God, but it's to start a family and to bring children into this world. Our Lord said, the Bible says, be fruitful and multiply. That's the purpose of marriage. If your goal is, or your understanding or your desire for your marriage to be about coupling, warm fuzzies, right? Intimacy, right? Being close, having a life partner of sorts. That's what marriage is. It's part of marriage. It can be a good thing within marriage, but you don't have to get married in order to have coupling. Marriage is about children. Marriage is about family. Our ancestors understood this. That's why, like I said earlier, to wrap it all up, that's why I'm here today. Because there was a common understanding and a bond related to our faith. And even if you had children, so many children, that it brought on certain aspects of sacrifice that was seen as a virtue in the old world, where now we don't embrace suffering at all anymore, right? We just want it good. We just want it comfortable. And yet look at the state of our culture. Look at the state of the family. Look at the state of our nations. It's all broken. Everybody's miserable. We're using more drugs than ever before. We're watching porn to please ourselves, right? We're embracing electronic gadgets. Our minds are like this all day long. We've become little automatrons. We're finding a way to deal with the pains of society on a daily basis by occupying our minds, because we're so broken. Our relationships are so broken that we need gadgets, we need drugs, we need pleasures so that we can all cope with everyday life. It only goes to show you how broken civilization is. And fundamentally, it starts with the institution of marriage. I'll go back to what I said when I first started this thing. You want a good, strong marriage? It's about God. You want to find a life partner? Somebody that will go walk with you through thick and thin? Put God first. My simplest advice is this. If you find a life partner that loves God more than that person loves you within the realm of that relationship, and they're not willing to sacrifice their principles, the eternal principles of our faith, in order to please you in whatever capacity that may be, there's a good chance that's the right partner for you. Because you should both be meeting like this in regards to faith and religion and following God's will. This is not to say that non-religious marriages don't work out. I've never said that. But I can tell you, those marriages usually have disorder. And that disorder usually falls along the familial lines, right? Offspring, either not having any offspring or offspring that usually get lost, right? Because we are family. That's what we are. This autonomous individual idea It's very liberal. It's very modern. And in many respects, it's very American. And the one thing that you can't say about America's strength is in its family. As Italians, and we're not the only ones. I've known Filipinos, I've known Hispanics, I've known Irish, I've known Germans that look at the American concept of family like, you guys just didn't get it right. Because American familial bonds generally don't work unless there's true deep devotion, faith in God. Some Protestants kind of do it, but generally America's greatest weakness is it never knew how to, again, establish strong familial bonds, right? You're 18 out the house, economic engine, prosperity. It doesn't matter if you're doing sex, drugs, rock and roll, what kind of experimentation, what kind of trouble you're getting. All that matters is you go out there and make the money. That's the American way. And that's why the American family has been broken for a long time. And those immigrants that got off the boat, while we were being lectured to by a lot of elements of American culture, we saw the problems and dysfunction of those American families 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago. And here we are. The only way this thing is repaired at this point in time is through the faith, finding the faith in the sacrament. I keep saying that. Everything in society is based on that. Governments, our relationship with our neighbors, economic prosperity, economic viability, I should say, everything, including marriage. Quite simple. In any relationship you have, including marriage, the further you drift away from the faith of our ancestors, sacred tradition, the 2,000-year analogy of the faith, Holy Mother Church, the sacraments, and Christ our King, the one great triune God that has laid down his dictates, the further you drift away from those principles, the more disordered all your relationships are going to be, including marriage. You want to find a strong, healthy marriage for yourself? Find the faith. Pray your rosary. Offer it up to Our Lady and St. Joseph. And ultimately, offer it up to God. There's not a greater blessing and healing. There's not a greater gift that can be given to you than a strong marriage, than when it has the blessings of God. Don't give me your Star Wars weddings. Don't give me your Marvel Comics weddings, okay? Don't give me your Elvis weddings, right? Come on, guys. Don't give me your City Hall weddings and things of that nature. Make it a sacrament. Do what your ancestors did. The great ancestors that built the West, that built our civilization, that gave us the strongest, most vibrant culture the world has ever known, and they gave us strong families, and they made the great sacrifices that most of us could be here today, the same sacrifices that the modern world is not willing to do. You want a strong marriage? Go to the church. Follow the dictates of the church. Trust me, the modern world is trying to destroy your marriage. Holy Mother Church has been there for 2,000 years. It's experienced every culture. It's experienced every period of history. Through the good times and through the bad times, the church has survived. Its values have built up strong, again, cultures, societies, communities. And for that, we've had many blessings. It's only when we've deviated away from Holy Mother Church and the sacraments and the one great true triune God that civilization has broken down. And it began by destroying the institution of marriage in the West. It began in many ways, don't get me wrong, it began with Protestantism, but we saw the cave in by Protestants in the 1920s when it came to contraception, and then we went through the sexual revolution only a few years later, or a couple of decades later after that, which wasn't a surprise, right? And ever since then, all families have been disproportionately affected by this great apostasy. Holy Mother Church, that's the answer to strong marriage. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.